Hello, my name is Tatum Garvin, and I'm going to talk about the criminal justice process in the Northern Triangle and the issues that lead to high impunity rates among these nations, as well as why this phenomenon is relevant to international studies and U.S. interest. First of all, what is the Northern Triangle? A simple Google search of the term will give you the articles titled, "A Murder Scene in Honduras," "Organized Crime in Central America, the Northern Triangle," "Corruption in the Northern Triangle," "Violence and Gangs in Central America's Northern Triangle." It is clear that this term has become interchangeable with the word violence. The Northern Triangle is a term coined to group the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. This began in 1992, when trade dialogues took place between Mexico and the three countries regarding the agreement that is commonly referred to as the Mexico Northern Triangle Free Trade Agreement. Now the term is used to group the nations based on their common issues with violence and crime, as opposed to their economic interests. Latin America is currently ranked as the world's most violent region by the UN, and according to Insight Crime, which is a foundation that studies organized crime as the principal threat to national and citizen security in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Northern Triangle is the world's second most violent sub-region, behind Southern Africa. So, how did this area become overrun with crime and corruption? We'll start with some historical background. After the discovery of the New World, the countries that now make up the Northern Triangle were under Spanish rule. Around 1840, after the American and French revolutions, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador became fully independent nations. In 1904, writer O. Henry created the term Banana Republic, and many political historians adopted the term to describe Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. This concept came from the idea that these nations were politically unstable and ruled by elite families that placed their priorities in foreign interest, specifically in fruit companies, and the poor leadership led to an impoverished working class and a wealthy, corrupt upper class. Since the countries gained independence around 1840, the Northern Triangle has been plagued with issues of foreign interventions, human rights violations, and coups constantly changing leadership. Honduras had 4 notable coups from 1911 to 2009. Guatemala had 3, starting with the 1954 US-backed coup, and their most recent one was in 1983. And El Salvador went through 2 coups in the 1960s and 70s. In 1960, Guatemala entered a civil war that would not be ended until 1996. Honduras and El Salvador fought what is referred to as the Soccer War in 1969. It was a brief conflict which happened to coincide with a 1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier match between the two countries. In 1981, Honduras became a front for the Contra War. The Contras were a U.S.-backed rebel group that opposed the left-wing Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Also around that time, El Salvador was engaged in a civil war for 12 years. This may seem like a lot of information, but this was all to say the Northern Triangle has a deep history of political instability. So what does this history have to do with the criminal justice systems today? Well, in the 1980s and 90s, there was an influx of immigration from the Northern Triangle to the United States. The political instability and violence, along with significant infrastructure damage due to Hurricane Mitch, led to the mass immigration. Many of these immigrants settled around the Los Angeles area. LA has a long history of gang violence, and it is no surprise that the marginalized immigrants found solidarity in their respective neighborhood gangs. Not to mention, some of these immigrants were guerrilla fighters in their home country, and a lifestyle of violence and crime was not foreign to them. In 1992, after the Los Angeles riots, police discovered the true strength and size of these Latin American gangs. Specifically, Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, or the 18th Street Gang, Mara 18. Stricter policy came into play in the mid-1990s regarding criminal justice in the United States, including charging more gang members as adults instead of minors and the three strikes you're out policy. Immigration law also became more strict during that time. According to Anna Arendt's article, How Street Gangs Took Central America, it is estimated that 20,000 young Central Americans were deported to their countries of origin. New immigration policy allowed the U.S. to deport violent criminals without notifying the receiving country of the deportee's criminal history. The governments of the Northern Triangle were already struggling to maintain civil control when the influx of criminals arrived. The young gang members were introduced into society and relied on their gang connections to adjust to their new surroundings. During this time, gang activity and crime increased significantly. The gangs became involved with more sophisticated organized crime, and the young gang members became the foot soldiers for drug traffickers, arms traffickers, and human traffickers. When these gangs teamed up with transnational criminal organizations, they outweighed and infiltrated the fragile government, which led to more corruption. As one can see, there is a complex history that has led to the violence and crime in the Northern Triangle. But just how bad is this crime? Here is a map from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The countries marked with dark red are countries that have upwards of 30 people killed per 100,000. All of the Northern Triangle countries are in dark red. According to Insight Crime, between the years 2011 and 2013, 48,947 people were murdered in the Northern Triangle. Of these reported homicides, 2,295 cases received conviction, making the impunity rate, or percent of crimes that go unpunished by law, 95% for homicides. The rate in the United States, for comparison, is 36%. According to Insight Crime and the 2013 Global Study on Homicide by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the statistics are as follows. In Honduras, between the years 2011 and 2013, there were 21,033 people killed, and the homicide rate for the most recent year is 84.3 people per 100,000. In Guatemala, the sum of people killed is 18,450, and the homicide rate is 34.6. In El Salvador, 9,464 people were killed, and the homicide rate is 39.8. Extortion and drug trafficking are also problems in these countries. According to the Council of Foreign Relations article, Central America's Violent Northern Triangle, El Salvadorians pay $390 million in extortion fees annually, while Hondurans pay $200 million and Guatemalans $61 million. Transnational crime organizations that engage in drug trafficking plague the Northern Triangle. According to a publication from the UNODC, roughly 65 of the 80 tons of cocaine transported to the United States by air lands in Honduras, and this represents 15% of U.S.-bound cocaine traffic. In 2008, North America consumed 196 tons of cocaine. Approximately 85% of cocaine in the United States flows through Central America, and in 2011 alone, more than 80 tons of cocaine were seized in Central America. We discussed earlier in the presentation what caused the migrants and deportees to engage in criminal activity. In addition, Jose Miguel Cruz writes in his article, The Survival of the Violent State, that economic globalization and neoliberal reforms enhance the effects that lead people to crime. There is also a pressure on people in poverty to find a social safety net. It is common in the Northern Triangle for many people to use criminal organizations as a safety net. Many join gangs for personal security reasons. These gangs become the surrogate family and government for youth living in poverty. However, we see examples in the United States of communities, specifically impoverished communities in major cities, who also use gangs as safety nets. Why is the Northern Triangle so different? The answer lies in the prosecutorial ability of each country. Prosecutors in the United States are more likely to take a case before a judge and get a conviction. Prosecutors in the Northern Triangle do not have the same ability. Prosecutors rely on investigators to bring them evidence, and the government to support and protect them. Issues arise when there is police mistrust or corruption, political instability, and threats to the prosecutor's life. These are issues that prosecutors in the Northern Triangle face. It is no surprise that the Northern Triangle has corruption in their heavily militarized police units after hearing the troubled past of these countries. Police forces in these countries have been exposed of extrajudicial killings, having ties with organized crime, and protecting and tipping off criminals. But in addition to corruption, many officers are not able to do their jobs effectively due to the politicalization of the police. Fears also plays a role in how officers handle cases. If they are noticed by a criminal for doing a good investigative job, their life becomes threatened. Another factor on the police's ability to investigate is the amount of funds provided by the government. For example, in Honduras, there are only 3 facilities in the country that can do autopsies. Forensic scientists and police aren't always able to transport the bodies of violent deaths to be autopsied due to lack of government funds. And they sometimes do not even have enough money to fill their vans with gas. This is also dangerous to transport bodies because if there is an investigation, someone might be caught, and criminals don't want that to happen. So if the bodies aren't autopsied, they cannot be ruled homicides, so they won't even be introduced into the justice system. In addition to police factors, political instability makes it difficult for prosecutors to succeed. After years of political unrest, there is residual corruption remaining in the governing bodies of the Northern Triangle. The wealthy and the elite are a small percentage of the country that hold the majority of power. Corruption leads to ineffective governing. An example is the lack of funds given towards criminal justice, revealed by the inability of forensic scientists to complete autopsies. Another example is the insufficient criminal justice policy implemented. Mano dura, or heavy hand reforms that increased punishment for criminals in Central America, were not proven to be effective according to the World Bank publication Crime and Violence in Central America, a Development Challenge. One reason given is the strict policy lowered the public's trust in the criminal justice system. The system is also missing key elements of effective criminal justice management, such as pre-trial detention, civil society oversight, and court administration and case management. Without these elements, prosecutors are left inadequately prepared to do their job. The final factor I will consider in this presentation is the safety concerns prosecutors face. One tragic example is the assassination of the chief prosecutor of Honduras's anti-money laundering unit in 2013. According to Insight Crime, Chavez was shot 7 times by attackers. He had received death threats over the phone and in person for months. This is not a unique case for the Northern Triangle. There is a real threat facing prosecutors that do their job effectively. So now we have a greater understanding of the issues facing criminal justice and prosecutorial effectiveness in the Northern Triangle. But why does this matter in the realm of international studies? Given the high homicide rates and violence in the communities, the human right to life is being threatened. When discussing international human rights, one cannot overlook the issues in the Northern Triangle. Children that grow up in dangerous neighborhoods will perpetuate the cycle of crime if there is not a motivating factor to deter from crime. International development and education must see the Northern Triangle as a region that is in need of education and other forms of social assistance. As long as these issues continue in the Northern Triangle, the mass immigration from these regions will persist. Right now, our world is facing an immigration crisis globally. I personally see tackling the push factors of immigration as the best way to handle it. In order to relieve some of the migrants fleeing violence in the Northern Triangle, the issues in those countries must be taken seriously. On the same topic, push factors in the Northern Triangle should be taken seriously by the United States. In 2014, we saw the influx of unaccompanied minors from Central America enter the United States. This mass migration is in response to the violence and crime in the Northern Triangle. It is important for the United States to be aware of the causes of this migration so it can handle the situation in one way or another. Another interest the United States has in paying attention to the criminal justice system in Central America is the fact that the drugs are being trafficked by these organizations and making their way into the United States. As the U.S. struggles to combat drug use within its borders, it would be beneficial to confront the source of these drugs, in addition to implementing drug abuse prevention and rehabilitation programs in country. However, the issue that probably would draw the most attention right now, given the average person's security concerns with the increased media awareness of the ISIS threats, is the lack of stability in the United States' southern neighbors leaves them vulnerable to extremist terrorist infiltration. By ignoring the issues that plague the Northern Triangle, the United States could potentially be leaving itself vulnerable. The issue of a flawed criminal justice system in the Northern Triangle should be a more pressing issue in American media. However, as this presentation reveals, there is no simple cause of this issue, and there will be no simple solution. Global issues are often complex, but understanding the components of them is the first step towards an effective solution. Thank you.